Officer Calloway and Officer Miller had long operated with a sense of unchecked power, turning their positions into tools of dominance rather than symbols of justice. Their patrols through the neighborhood did not inspire safety but rather unease. Residents learned to walk the other way when they saw the two officers approach, avoiding eye contact, keeping their voices hushed and their heads down. Everyone knew that even the smallest perceived slight, a delayed response, a questioning glance, a simple refusal, could ignite their fury. Calloway was the calculated one. His every move was deliberate, his sharp blue eyes scanning the streets for easy prey. He didn't act out of anger but out of a twisted sense of control. He enjoyed the power, the way people's hands trembled when they reached for their IDs, the way their voices wavered when he questioned them. He had a talent for manipulation, turning an innocent conversation into an interrogation, a harmless movement into a threat. If he wanted to arrest someone, he would find a reason. If there was no reason, he would create one. Miller, on the other hand, was unpredictable. He had a short temper and an even shorter fuse. Unlike Calloway, who played the long game, Miller was impulsive, acting first and thinking later, if he thought at all. He thrived on control, but he demanded more than just obedience, he wanted submission. When a suspect hesitated, even for a moment, his anger flared. A shove turned into a punch, a push became a beating. He didn't care who was watching. He knew the system would protect him. It always had. The community had tried to fight back before. Complaints had been filed, witnesses had stepped forward, protests had been organized. But none of it mattered. Reports were conveniently lost in the system. Those who spoke out found themselves suddenly facing charges of their own, false accusations that ruined lives. People learned that standing against Calloway and Miller meant putting themselves and their families at risk. So, one by one, they fell silent. Fear won. But one evening, everything changed. Malcolm Hayes was not an easy target. He had spent years in this city, watching men like Calloway and Miller abuse their power, preying on the vulnerable. He had seen friends, neighbors, and even strangers fall victim to their unchecked authority, their lives shattered by lies and violence. And he had had enough. When the officers stopped him, demanding his identification with their usual arrogance, he did not stammer. He did not lower his gaze or shrink away in submission. Instead, he met Calloway's piercing stare with unwavering defiance. "What's the problem, officer?" His voice was calm, steady, but there was an undeniable steel beneath it. Miller's fingers twitched, already eager for an excuse to act. Calloway smirked, sensing the challenge. This was different. Most people broke under their scrutiny, but Hayes stood firm. "You fit the description of a suspect," Calloway said smoothly, his fingers tapping against the holster at his hip. It was a lie, everyone knew it. A convenient excuse, used over and over again. Hayes didn't flinch. "That so?" His hands remained at his sides, but his posture was firm, unyielding. "Then go ahead. Check your records. But I won't be harassed." The tension in the air thickened. A small crowd had gathered, wary eyes watching, phones held discreetly at their sides. People had seen this scene play out before, but tonight, something was different. Hayes wasn't backing down, and for the first time, Calloway and Miller weren't in full control of the situation. Miller took a step forward, aggression radiating off him. His jaw clenched, his breathing uneven. Calloway, however, hesitated. The phones, the eyes, the silent witnesses, it made him pause. A slow realization crept into his expression, this was not going to end the way it usually did. For the first time in a long time, the fear wasn't coming from the community. It was coming from them. The night was thick with the oppressive weight of summer heat, the kind that made the air feel heavy, clinging to the skin like an unwanted embrace. Streetlights buzzed overhead, their dim glow casting long, distorted shadows along the cracked pavement. The city was alive in its usual way, cars honking in the distance, voices murmuring from dimly lit storefronts, the occasional burst of laughter from unseen alleyways. But in this moment, none of that mattered. Officers Calloway and Miller stood at the corner, their presence predatory, scanning the street with the sharpness of men who had long mistaken power for justice. They weren't just patrolling. They were looking. Looking for someone who would make their night interesting. Someone who would make their jobs feel important. And then they saw him. Malcolm Hayes moved with a quiet certainty, his steps measured, his posture relaxed but aware. His broad frame carried no aggression, just purpose. He was dressed plainly, dark jeans, a navy blue hoodie zipped halfway up, but to men like Calloway and Miller, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was alone. That he fit a profile built in their minds long before this night ever began. Miller nudged Calloway, his voice low. "That one. What do you think?" Calloway smirked, a familiar glint in his eye. "Let's find out." They moved in without hesitation, stepping directly into Malcolm's path, their bodies blocking his way as if their presence alone was law. "Evening," Calloway drawled, tilting his chin up slightly. "Got a minute?" Malcolm stopped, his gaze shifting between the two officers. His expression didn't change. No panic. No unease. Just the steady assessment of a man who had been here before. "What's the problem?" he asked, his tone even. Miller took a step closer, resting a hand near his holster. Not a direct threat, just enough to remind Malcolm of the unspoken rules. "Mind showing us some ID?" There was a pause, thick and heavy. Malcolm exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening just slightly, though his stance remained firm. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of fear. "What's the reason?" he asked. Calloway's smirk widened just a bit. He enjoyed this part, the little game before the inevitable obedience. "You match a description," he said, his voice casual, almost amused. Malcolm held his gaze. "What description?" Miller's fingers twitched at his side. The question was a small act of defiance, but it was enough to make irritation flicker across his face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Most people complied by now, fumbling for their wallets, nodding quickly, trying to make the interaction as brief as possible. Calloway's smile tightened. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Malcolm let out a quiet breath. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the invisible noose tightening. He had choices. He could comply. He could hand over his ID, keep his voice calm, avoid confrontation. But deep down, he knew the truth, it wouldn't matter. He had seen it happen too many times. The moment he gave them an inch, they would take a mile. "I know how this works," Malcolm said, his voice quiet but edged with steel. "You stop someone. You don't like how they answer. Suddenly, they're resisting. Then comes the shove. The knee in the back. Maybe worse." He shook his head, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. "Not tonight." Calloway's smirk faltered, just for a second. Malcolm caught it. So did the growing crowd nearby. Pedestrians had slowed their steps, phones appearing in careful hands, recording from a distance. A few whispered among themselves, their eyes darting toward the officers, toward Malcolm. Miller noticed. His jaw tensed, his patience fraying. "Are you refusing to comply?" Malcolm lifted his chin. "I'm refusing to be harassed." Silence stretched between them. Calloway's fingers flexed at his side, his body taut with unspent aggression. The old instincts whispered, "Push him, make him react, turn this into something justifiable." But the crowd was watching. The cameras were rolling. And suddenly, for the first time in a long time, the power they wielded so carelessly didn't feel so absolute. Malcolm didn't move. He didn't cower. He simply stared, unyielding, as if daring them to decide what kind of men they really were. The night air was heavy, thick with the scent of rain that had yet to fall. Streetlights flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked pavement. The city never truly slept, but tonight, the restless energy in the air felt different, charged, like a live wire ready to snap. Malcolm Hayes stood in the center of it all, his breath slow and controlled, his heartbeat a steady drum against his ribs. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, watching, waiting. The crowd had gathered quickly, drawn by the unmistakable scent of conflict, their phone cameras glowing like fireflies in the dark. Facing him, Officer Calloway and his partner, Miller, stood rigid, their hands twitching near their belts. The tension between them was almost unbearable, a silent battle of wills playing out in the space of a few feet. Calloway's face was tight with barely contained frustration, his fingers flexing and curling into a fist at his side. He was the kind of man who demanded unquestioning obedience, and Malcolm's quiet defiance, his refusal to shrink, to cower, was an insult he would not tolerate. "Hands behind your head," Calloway ordered, his voice sharp, clipped. Malcolm didn't move. Not out of defiance, not out of arrogance, but because he knew. He knew that no matter what he did, no matter how compliant he was, the outcome had already been decided. His mind flashed back to all the others, the ones who had raised their hands, the ones who had gone to their knees, the ones who had begged. It had never mattered. The crowd murmured uneasily. Someone shouted, "He didn't do anything." Calloway's patience snapped like a frayed rope. His hand shot out, shoving Malcolm hard in the chest. The force sent him stumbling backward, his shoes skidding against the pavement as he fought to stay upright. The onlookers erupted. Shouts of outrage rang out, voices thick with anger and fear. Someone moved forward as if to intervene, but hesitated at the last second, uncertain. Malcolm exhaled sharply, his hands balling into fists at his sides. The instinct to defend himself was screaming in his veins, but he forced himself to stay still. He could take a hit. He could endure the humiliation. But if he fought back, if he gave them the smallest excuse. A second blow came, this time from Officer Miller, his grip like a vice as he yanked Malcolm's arm behind his back. Pain lanced through his shoulder, but he gritted his teeth and said nothing. "Get on the ground," Calloway barked, shoving him again. Malcolm refused to fall. He wasn't resisting, but he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of total surrender either. The knee came next, brutal, unforgiving, slamming into the back of his leg and forcing him down. Gravel bit into his palms as his knees hit the pavement. "Stay down," Calloway growled, pressing his weight onto Malcolm's back. The breath rushed from Malcolm's lungs as the officer's knee dug into his spine. Cold metal snapped around his wrist, first one cuff, then the other. The bite of steel against his skin was sharp, familiar. "Stop resisting," Calloway muttered, though Malcolm wasn't moving. He wasn't resisting. He never had been. But none of that mattered. It never did. The rain came down in a steady, relentless rhythm, the streets slick with the sheen of water and oil, reflecting the harsh glare of the streetlights. The city felt like it was holding its breath, as if waiting for something to snap. Malcolm Hayes stood hidden in the shadows, his eyes narrowed, watching the street ahead. His pulse was steady, but his mind was racing. His body, though physically battered and bruised, had never felt more alive. Weeks of frustration and humiliation had built up inside him, festering like an open wound. The officers, especially Officer Calloway, had pushed him too far. That night, the night they had beaten him in front of everyone, Malcolm had tried to stay calm. He had tried to stay composed, to fight back only with his words. But it hadn't worked. Calloway had made sure of that. They had pinned him down, brutalized him, and labeled him as just another troublemaker without a second thought. It wasn't just the pain that stung. It was the injustice. The cruelty. The way Calloway had smiled down at him with that mocking expression, as if he were nothing more than an insect to be squashed underfoot. And the worst part, Calloway had walked away without a single consequence, while Malcolm was left to lick his wounds and wonder if anyone would ever care about his side of the story. But tonight, things would be different. The sound of tires splashing in the puddles snapped him from his thoughts. The black sedan rolled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the gloom. The engine revved briefly before the car came to a halt. Calloway stepped out, his uniform crisp, his posture relaxed, too relaxed. He was clearly unaware of what was waiting for him. Malcolm's grip tightened around the cold metal of the gun hidden beneath his jacket, feeling the weight of it as it steadied his nerves. For a moment, he hesitated. This wasn't him. This wasn't the man he wanted to be. He had always fought for something greater: justice, equality, the right to be treated as a human being. But as he watched Calloway walk toward his car with his smug, self-satisfied air, Malcolm felt that old, familiar fire flare up inside him. The fire that had been kindled every time he was wronged, every time the system had turned its back on him. The fire that had now reached its peak. He didn't want to do this. He didn't want to sink to the same level as the man who had caused him so much pain. But what choice did he have? The system had failed him. The world had failed him. And now, there was only one thing left to do. He stepped forward, his shoes tapping softly on the wet pavement, each step echoing in the silence like a drumbeat. The air felt thick, as though everything was holding its breath, just like him. His heart raced with adrenaline, but his movements were controlled. The anger was still there, simmering under the surface, but he had learned to focus it, to harness it. "Remember me?" Malcolm's voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but it sliced through the night like a razor. Calloway's head snapped around in surprise. His eyes widened for just a moment before recognition flickered in them. But it was too late. Malcolm didn't give him a chance to speak. Before Calloway could react, Malcolm was on him, the gun now in his hand, the cold metal pressing against Calloway's chest. The officer froze, his face draining of color as he took in the look of determination in Malcolm's eyes. Malcolm's hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. He wanted to feel empowered, to feel like he had the upper hand for once. But deep down, he felt something else, an emptiness. He wasn't doing this because he enjoyed it. He was doing this because he had no other choice. "You thought you could break me, didn't you?" Malcolm's voice trembled, not from fear, but from the years of pent-up rage and hurt that had been simmering beneath the surface. His words were laced with a quiet venom, the kind that only came from being pushed too far. "You thought you could get away with it, with your badge, with your power, with your lies." Calloway opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to make some kind of excuse, but Malcolm wasn't interested in hearing it. He had heard enough of the lies. The excuses. The justifications. "You should have stayed away," Malcolm muttered, his hand tightening around the grip of the gun. In that instant, something inside him shifted, something he couldn't quite describe. The anger still burned, but now it was mixed with a strange, bitter clarity. This wasn't justice. This wasn't the answer. But it was all he had left. His breath was shallow, his heart hammering in his chest, but his hand didn't waver. Malcolm was no longer the scared, broken man who had been left in the streets to die. No, now he was someone else. Someone who had nothing left to lose. "Do you feel it?" Malcolm's voice was low now, almost inaudible as he spoke through gritted teeth. "Do you feel the fear? Do you finally understand what it's like to be powerless?" Calloway's eyes darted between Malcolm and the weapon in his hand, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He was trembling now, his bravado slipping away. But it didn't matter. Malcolm took a deep breath, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. For a fleeting moment, he considered pulling the trigger. He could end it right there, take back some small piece of the power that had been stripped from him. But as his finger hovered over the trigger, something inside him stopped. This wasn't him. He lowered the gun slowly, the weight of it still heavy in his hand, but the fire inside him slowly began to die down. Calloway, still frozen, looked like he had been granted mercy. But in truth, it was Malcolm who had just been saved. With a final, disdainful glance at the officer, Malcolm turned and walked away, the rain soaking through his jacket. His mind was a storm of thoughts, each one clashing against the other. The night was far from over, and the battle for justice was far from won. But for the first time in a long while, Malcolm felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The city had always been a place of controlled chaos, but tonight, it felt different. There was a palpable tension in the air, a feeling of anticipation that gripped everyone who walked the streets, who sat behind desks, who observed from windows. The weather, too, seemed to sense the shift. The heavy clouds rolled in, a dark curtain that covered the sky, and the rain began to fall slowly, as if hesitating before letting loose. The quiet hum of the city was deafening, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen, for a moment that would change everything. Inside the police precinct, the mood was one of unease. The usual noise of ringing phones and shuffled paperwork was now a distant hum. Officers moved with a sense of urgency, their movements faster than normal, but lacking any of the confidence that once accompanied their duties. The reports of Malcolm Hayes' actions had spread throughout the building, and with each passing minute, the fear intensified. Lieutenant Harris paced back and forth in his office, his footsteps echoing through the hollow hallways. His mind raced, filled with thoughts he could not escape. The force, once so sure of itself, was now in disarray. The events that had transpired between Malcolm and Officer Calloway weren't just a small skirmish, they were a clear signal that something was terribly wrong, and it was now spiraling out of control. He could feel the anxiety in his bones, a sense of impending disaster that seemed to tighten its grip on his chest. "I should have known," Harris muttered to himself, running a hand over his tired face. This wasn't just about Calloway. It was about everything. All the years of injustice, of power being misused. Malcolm, he's the spark. And we're the tinder. The lieutenant's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock on his door. He turned to find one of his officers, visibly shaken, standing in the doorway. "Sir," the officer began, his voice trembling, "there's a crowd gathering outside. They're chanting for Malcolm. They're calling for justice." Harris felt a heavy weight settle in his stomach. The protests had begun. It was only a matter of time before they reached their boiling point, and once they did, there would be no turning back. He could already hear the chants in his mind, a sea of voices crying out for the very thing the police force had so long failed to provide: justice. But it wasn't just Malcolm they were rallying for, it was for all the wrongs, all the years of corruption, of brutality, of silence. The community had had enough. Back at the scene of the initial altercation, Officer Calloway sat in his office, his hands shaking as he stared at the report in front of him. The weight of his actions bore down on him like a crushing force. The cocky confidence he had once carried so easily was nowhere to be found now. The violence, the disregard for life, it had all come crashing down on him. His reputation, once built on arrogance and entitlement, now lay in ruins. He couldn't look anyone in the eye, knowing the truth of what had transpired. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself, the words barely leaving his lips. His thoughts were a whirlwind of regret, anger, and fear. He had always thought of the badge as a shield, an unbreakable symbol of power. But now, that same badge felt like a target, an invitation for the very people he had oppressed to come for him, to come for all of them. He knew the truth now: the system had been broken for so long, and he had been a part of it, actively contributing to its rot. Outside, the protest had grown in size and intensity. The people were no longer just speaking in hushed voices, they were shouting, marching, their demands echoing through the streets. Malcolm had become their figurehead, their symbol of resistance. Every chant, every sign they held was a reflection of the anger and frustration that had been brewing for far too long. It was no longer about one officer's wrongdoing, it was about the collective oppression the community had endured. It was about making their voices heard, about taking back control from a corrupt system that had silenced them for years. As the protests raged outside, Harris felt the fear seeping deeper into his skin. His officers were scrambling, trying to maintain some semblance of order, but the truth was, they were terrified. The streets were no longer under their control. The people had risen, and the force was no longer the one with the power. Harris could see it in their eyes. This wasn't just about keeping the peace anymore. This was about survival. Calloway, still trapped in his own personal hell, knew that his role in this had irrevocably changed. The people would not forget, and they would not forgive. They had seen the corruption, the violence, and they were no longer willing to sit idly by. He could already hear the sirens wailing in the distance, the sound of justice marching closer with every passing second. The battle had begun, and no one, least of all him, could escape its reach. Across the city, more voices joined the chorus. The air was thick with anger, with determination, with the raw emotion of a community demanding what had been denied to them for so long. The protest was no longer just about one man, it was about every person who had been wronged by the system. It was about reclaiming their dignity, their rights, their humanity. The fight was no longer just about one wrong being righted. It was about the greater fight for justice, the greater struggle for change. Malcolm Hayes had become the symbol of that fight. His actions had sparked a flame, one that was quickly spreading through the streets, through the hearts of those who had long felt unheard. The battle for justice was no longer just a dream. It was a living, breathing force that no one could ignore. And as the night fell and the protests reached their peak, it became clearer than ever that the fight was only beginning. The police were no longer the ones in control. The people had taken their stand, and they would not be silenced. The weight of the situation was unbearable for both Calloway and Miller. What had once been their empire, built on manipulation, deceit, and the abuse of power, was now crumbling around them. It wasn't just the fear of losing their careers that gripped them, it was the suffocating knowledge that the truth had finally come to light, and there was no escaping it. They had spent years in the shadows, pulling the strings, making decisions that no one questioned. But now, the very thing they had feared most had come to pass, they were exposed. The world, the people they had once controlled, were turning on them. Calloway's office felt colder than ever before. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed incessantly, and yet there was no warmth in the room. His once immaculate uniform, a symbol of power and prestige, now seemed like an unbearable weight on his shoulders. He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the tension that had been building inside him for days. The texts, the phone calls, the whispers, they had all led to this moment. His world, the one he had meticulously crafted over years of ruthless ambition, was falling apart in a matter of hours. His thoughts were erratic. How did it get this far? How did I let this happen? He had always believed he was untouchable, above reproach. His position as a senior officer had afforded him the luxury of bending the rules, of twisting the system to his will. For years, he had ruled his precinct with an iron fist, instilling fear and compliance in his subordinates. His corruption was so deeply ingrained that it had become second nature to him, an undeniable force that he believed could not be broken. But now, sitting alone in his office, he realized just how fragile his power had been. It was built on lies, on cover-ups, and on the suffering of others. Calloway's eyes darted to the door. He could hear the murmur of voices from the hallway, the murmurs of officers who once respected him, now whispering behind his back, wondering when the hammer would fall. He could feel their judgment, sharp and unyielding, crawling under his skin. The walls that had once shielded him from the consequences of his actions were now closing in. It was only a matter of time before the investigation would sweep through the precinct like a storm, taking everything in its path. His phone buzzed, and the screen lit up with a single message. It was for Miller. The words were simple but carried the weight of the impending disaster: "We're finished." Miller, too, was in the throes of his own personal crisis. The once confident, authoritative figure who had climbed the ranks through manipulation and deceit was now on the edge of complete collapse. He had always been the calm one, the one who kept a cool head, who made decisions with calculated precision. But now, as he sat in his office, the enormity of the situation was sinking in, and the cold sweat on his brow betrayed the facade he had worked so hard to maintain. The reports of his involvement in the cover-up of Calloway's brutal actions were spreading like wildfire. No matter how much he tried to distance himself, to claim ignorance or shift the blame, the truth was undeniable. His association with Calloway, the corruption they had shared, was now front and center. It was all coming undone, and he could feel the ground slipping away beneath him. Miller's fingers hovered over his desk, the once sharp, meticulous notes he had written now meaningless. His eyes scanned the room, the shelves lined with accolades, the photographs of him shaking hands with dignitaries, the awards he had accumulated over the years. All of it felt hollow now. It was as though the very walls of his office were mocking him, reminding him of the life he had built on deception. He had always justified his actions, telling himself that the end justified the means. But now, with everything collapsing around him, he couldn't ignore the guilt that gnawed at him. The years of bending the rules, covering up the worst crimes, all for the sake of power, it had seemed like the path to success. But now, it felt like a prison. The walls were closing in, and there was no way out. The phone on his desk buzzed, shaking him out of his thoughts. A message from his superior flashed on the screen. "We need to talk." Miller's heart sank. He knew what was coming. The investigation was inevitable, and there was no escaping it. He could already hear the whispers of his colleagues, the judgment in their eyes. The walls of his career had crumbled, and now the reality of it all was sinking in. The protesters outside the precinct were a constant reminder of the chaos that had erupted. The demands for justice, the cries for accountability, rang in his ears. It was no longer just about Calloway and Miller, it was about the entire system, the corruption that had been allowed to fester for so long. They were the faces of everything that was wrong, and now they were the ones being hunted. As the days passed, both Calloway and Miller found themselves in a constant state of dread. Every time the phone rang, every time a colleague looked at them with disdain, every time they caught a glimpse of the protests outside, they were reminded that their careers were over. The people were no longer afraid of them, they were afraid of what they had become. The two men had built their empires on lies, but now the truth was exposed for all to see. Calloway's thoughts turned bitter. This is it. There's no coming back from this. He had been untouchable for so long, but now, he was just like the criminals he had once so easily imprisoned. Who's left to protect us now? Miller, too, was grappling with the same bitter reality. His thoughts were clouded by the same regret that Calloway felt. He had thought he could outsmart the system forever, that he could control everything. But the reckoning had come, and now, there was nothing they could do to stop it. As the investigation gained momentum, as the voices of the people grew louder, it became clear that the downfall of Calloway and Miller was inevitable. The truth had come to light, and there was no escaping the consequences. They had been the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong, the ones who had abused their power and betrayed the trust of the people they were sworn to protect. And now, as they faced the wreckage of their careers, they realized that their rise to power had been a hollow victory. The consequences of their actions were far greater than they had ever imagined. And as the walls of their world came crashing down, they were left with nothing but the shattered remains of their once promising careers, and the painful, unavoidable truth that justice had finally caught up with them. The courtroom was unnervingly still. A palpable silence hung in the air, thick with the weight of anticipation, as the final moments of the trial loomed near. Everyone knew that the end was coming, but no one could predict the toll it would take. The eyes of the audience, the reporters, the families, everyone was fixed on the bench, where Judge Anderson sat with his cold, impassive gaze. His hand gripped the gavel, but it was not the tool of power that anyone was concerned with now, it was the harbinger of justice that everyone awaited. Malcolm Calloway, once a figure of authority and power, now sat hunched in his seat. His broad shoulders, once straight with the confidence of a man who believed he could manipulate the system to his will, were now sagging under the weight of the inevitable. His hands were clenched tightly, white knuckles betraying the fear he could not hide. Calloway had spent years building a fortress of lies and deceit around himself, thinking that the law was something that could be bent, that it was something that could be ignored by those in power. But now, as the prosecutor's final arguments echoed in his ears, there was no escaping the truth that had come crashing down on him. The fortress had crumbled, and there was nothing left but the cold, hard reality of his betrayal. His gaze flickered briefly to his partner in crime, Miller Harris, seated beside him. Harris, too, had once been an untouchable figure, smooth, calculating, always in control. But today, he was a shadow of that man. His face, once sharp with the confidence of someone who had managed to stay ahead of the law, was now drawn and hollow. His eyes, once filled with the arrogance of a man who thought he could outsmart anyone, were wide, his pupils dilated with panic. Every breath he took seemed labored, every movement deliberate, as though he was trying to keep himself composed for the inevitable but knowing it was all in vain. The weight of the trial had worn him down, but it was the judgment, the finality of the gavel, that would break him. The prosecutor's voice rang through the courtroom, relentless and unwavering. Each word was like a sword cutting through the thin veil of deception that Calloway and Miller had carefully constructed. He recounted the countless lives ruined by their corruption, the families destroyed, the community betrayed by those who were supposed to protect it. The evidence was undeniable, the witnesses irrefutable. There was no escape for them now. The years of power, the manipulation, the lies, all of it had led to this moment. The public had been lied to, and now it was time for the truth to surface. Calloway felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. His stomach churned as he relived every dirty deal, every shady operation that had led to this point. His mind raced, spinning through the years of manipulation and corruption, the moments when he had thought he was untouchable. Each misstep, each betrayal, felt like a stab to his gut, reminding him that he had sold his soul. The truth, no matter how hard he tried to bury it, was here now, and it was too late to do anything but face it. Harris, too, felt his insides twist in knots. He had thought, for a long time, that his charm and quick wit could protect him. He had lived in a world of half-truths, believing that as long as he could control the narrative, he could control the outcome. But now, as the prosecutor's words reverberated in his skull, the reality set in. He had no power left. His influence, his connections, his reputation, all of it had evaporated. He was just another criminal, sitting in the same seat as anyone else who had crossed the line. The magnitude of his actions finally hit him. His mind replayed the faces of those he had betrayed, the victims whose lives he had ruined. He could see their faces, feel their pain. There was no hiding from it now. The defense attorney for both men stood up, but there was no conviction in his voice. Once so certain of victory, now he spoke with the hollow tones of a man who knew his efforts were in vain. He begged for leniency, citing their years of service, their contributions to the force. But his words fell flat, like the desperate pleas of a man trying to hold back an oncoming storm. He was well aware that these pleas were meaningless, that there was no mercy to be found here. He knew what the verdict would be. The judge, a man of few words, sat stoically throughout the proceedings. His expression betrayed nothing, no sign of emotion, no hint of empathy. He had seen countless trials in his career, but there was something about this case that felt different. It wasn't just the crimes of Calloway and Miller, it was what their betrayal represented. It was a breach of trust, an abuse of power at the highest level. The trust that people had placed in the justice system had been shattered by these men, and the consequences were not just about them, it was about everyone they had wronged. The room seemed to hold its breath as Judge Anderson raised his gavel, his voice cold and steady. Malcolm Calloway, Miller Harris, you have been found guilty of all charges. Abuse of power, corruption, betrayal of the public trust. You have undermined the very principles of justice that we hold dear. The sentences imposed upon you will be harsh, as they must be. You will serve time for the crimes you've committed, and you will pay for the destruction you've caused. Calloway's heart sank. The weight of the words crashed into him like a tidal wave. His throat tightened, and for the first time, the reality of his downfall felt suffocating. It was over. There was no more fighting, no more escaping. All of his lies, all of the walls he had built to protect himself, had come crashing down. He had thought he could outrun this moment. But now, in the cold light of truth, he understood that there was no escaping justice. Harris, too, sat frozen, the words like daggers in his chest. His mind was a blur, his thoughts spiraling into darkness. He had thought he was too clever to be caught, that he could outwit everyone around him. But now, the courtroom felt like a cage, its walls closing in. His body trembled, but there was no turning back. The chains of justice had tightened around him, and there was no escape. As the gavel fell, the finality of the moment echoed through the room. It was over. Calloway and Miller were no longer men of power, they were criminals, stripped of their influence, their reputations destroyed. The sentence had been passed, and now there was nothing left but the cold, unforgiving grip of justice. The courtroom, once filled with uncertainty, now stood as a symbol of the triumph of truth. The system had worked, and the guilty had been held accountable. The final judgment had been delivered. And in the end, justice had prevailed.